Hello, Naomi.
Hi.
So, how are you?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank God. I'm looking forward to talking to you today about somebody special to us. You know who that is?
No,
Yes,
surprise
you
me.
do. You do. Who's special? The Alter Rebbe of Chabad. Why is he special to us?
We are descendants of the Alter Rebbe.
Yes, we are descendants of the Alter Rebbe, and he's a big inspiration to us and to many people, in fact. So I'm looking forward to talking to you. I know you have some questions prepared, and let's jump in to talk about our great grandfather and who he was and how we can make our lives better with with what he came up with, his ideas.
Great. Great. So yeah, let's start with who was the Alter Rebbe. What was the time period and the place he lived in, and so on.
So that's a great question. So the Alter Rebbe was a rabbi that was from Lithuania and then and White Russia. He lived in Lithuania and some sections of Russia during the course of his life. He was born in 1745 and he passed away in 1812. And some people call him the Schneur Zalman was his actual name, and they would call him Schneur Zalman of Liadi because the name of the town that he was the rabbi for a number of years was called Liadi. So that was one of his names. Eventually, he became known as the Alter Rebbe of Chabad many years later, probably after his lifetime. You know, like the Alter Rebbe just means the old Rebbe. So you don't call a living Rebbe the old Rebbe. That would be a generation or two after somebody passed away. You'd call him the Alter Rebbe of Chabad.
Great. So with that general background in mind, let's talk about, I guess, the education of the Alter Rebbe, which is, the basic foundation of any great leader, and some of his teachers growing up, and his background, what that influenced him.
Yes, education. Even though the Alter Rebbe was, I don't want to call him self-taught because he had a teacher named, I think his name was Yisachar Dov of Lubavitch, who by the time he was like 12, he told the father of Schneur Zalman that I've taught him everything I know. Like he can learn on his own now. He was already quite a accomplished Torah scholar by the time he was 12 years old. At some point as a teenager, the community gave him smicha. They ordained him because he was a teacher at a very young age. And there's a legend, I don't know if we even know their names, but there were these two brothers from Bohemia who were scholars both of Talmud, of Kabbalah, of astronomy, of science, and they taught the Alter Rebbe a lot of these things that were kind of outside of the typical learning that a regular Talmud teacher would teach you. So he had this very interesting early education, but his main teacher wasn't his teacher of his youth or these two brothers, as important as they were. When he got a little older, he had already mastered the Talmud and the major codes of law and many other works. He was some type of genius. I don't know what happened to the family. It's a smart family, but he was on another level. So he actually said at that time there were two teachers that had each created an attractive group of people who wanted to study or follow them. And one of those teachers was the famous Gaon of Vilna, and the other was the second leader of the Hasidic movement. We actually did a video about him, Rabbi Dov Ber of Mizrich, the Mizrich known as the Mizricher Maggid. And what the little Alter Rebbe, or the young Alter Rebbe, who was not little anymore, he was a young man, he said, is I know something about Talmud, how to learn the Talmud. I know I don't really know anything about Kabbalah, about serving God through prayer and so on. And that's, to do that, to become a servant of God in that way, the place to go was Mizrich. So he went to Mizrich. He quickly became a very important student to the Maggid of Mizrich. He absorbed a lot. He got very close to the other students, some more than others. Some of those friendships would remain with him during the course of his lifetime. We could talk about that as well. But he really it really changed the course of part of the world's history, that he went to the Maggid of Mizrich and became a chassid and then became a rebbe. So that's a big decision that changed a lot. The outcome was a major outcome.
Wow, that's very interesting stuff there. So I guess that really gives us a good background information of, speaking of the Maggid, who we spoke about before, and that a rich, you could see, along with his own genius, as you mentioned, a lot of like the rich education that inspired the Alter Rebbe growing up. So from there, as the Alter Rebbe came into his own as a teacher himself, I'd love to ask you about some of his works and his contributions to Hasidism, specifically his own literature, things he's written. I guess to sort of simplify it, like what would you consider to be like the most famous of his Hasidic works of the Alter Rebbe?
Well, I would venture to say that the most famous work, and he had a number of major works, 5 very well-known works, and dozens of other works that were eventually brought to the press, some even recently. But the most famous of his work would be the Tanya. The Tanya, but before we get to the Tanya, the thing that established him as a super genius and a leader of great renown within the Hasidic movement is he didn't just write essays of Hasidic thought, which was important because the early Hasidic Rebbes were very sparse in their writing. They taught more than they wrote. But besides for that, he also authored under the directions that he should write such a work of the Maggid, his teacher, the Shulchan Aruch Harav. It's called the Code of Jewish Law of the Rav. Now, the Shulchan Aruch actually existed prior to the Alter Rebbe. He just rewrote his own version, an updated version, so to speak. It had already been 200 years since the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Cairo, with the glosses, the notes of Rabbi Moshe Isserlich, was written, and the Alter Rebbe wrote kind of an updated version of things that had transpired, major halachic rulings, such as the rulings of the Magen Avraham and others that had transpired in the interim period. So I before I get into the Tanya,
or in the Alter Rebbe's updated version, what were the updates that the Alter Rebbe did that really established him, as you said, as somebody, the great leader that all these other works sort of sprouted from?
So I would say that what the style that the Alter Rebbe to some degree innovated is usually there were 2 methods of writing a commentary. One was writing a code of law. So, for example, that code of law was the first code of law that was systematic, not just based on the Talmud, was Maimonides, and then you had the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. You had other, and the Shulchan Aruch, although there was another book authored by the same author of the Shulchan Aruch called the Beis Yosef that had elaborate explanations. The Shulchan Aruch didn't really get into the explanations. Maimonides in this Mishnah Torah didn't get into the explanations of why we follow this ruling and what's behind it. And the Alter Rebbe, what he did is he gave a little bit of insight into how we got to understand the rule, not just this is what we do. Not a full explanation, but a partial explanation, enough for a scholar to analyze and get a lot more out of. So in a sense, the Alter Rebbe wasn't just a dynamic force of the Hasidic world. He arguably was one of the most dynamic Lithuanian thinkers up until today, meaning at some point there was another style, somebody who copied that style named the Aruch HaShulchan, and other thinkers such as the Soloveitchik family, who employed certain stylistic methodologies of interpreting the Talmud that were preceded by thinkers like the Alter Rebbe. But the Alter Rebbe had already put down very deep roots into Talmudic analysis. He wasn't the only one, he wasn't the first one or the last one, but he was one of the most significant ones in his way he did that. So before we even get into his Hasidic contributions, we have to acknowledge his contributions to the greater Torah world of halacha and Talmud, which are major in and of their own rights. It's a master work for those who want to understand how the Talmud is applied in halacha, how it kind of gets from the Talmud through the Rishonim, the medieval period, and the Achronim, the later, the more contemporary, the poskim of 300-400 years ago, maybe not quite contemporary, but how we get to where we are now. And he did a magnificent job in doing that. Unfortunately, not all of his writings, the Shulchan Aruch, survived. But what we have quite a bit of it, and what we have is very special.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that sort of background to launch off of. So with that in mind, we have, the updated, the Alter Rebbe's update of the Shulchan Aruch that really launches him as a figure, and then sort of the Tanya in the realm of Hasidism being his most famous work. Let's talk about the Tanya a bit, in a nutshell. Let's start with, I know that, there's obviously a lot, but to start, the general, I know that there's 5 basic sections, and that if you could give that a sort of a nutshell, just version of what the 5 sections of the Tanya are, to the general basics, and then we can, talk about that. I'd love to know.
Sure, Naomi. There are 5 sections. The first section is literally called Tanya, and that is how, we can get into it more in detail, but it's about the two souls at war with each other, the godly soul and the animal soul. And the premise of it is that we can all control, maybe not our things that images that come up from our unconscious mind, we can't control that, but we can control kind of what we choose to think about, speak about, and do. And even though it's not easy, he offers a plan on how to have self-mastery. And that's why it's called the Sefer Shel Beinoni. The Beinoni means the everyman. It isn't really every man who could become master of their destiny. But that's the goal of what he sets out to do. So that's section 1. Section 2 is called the Gate of Unity and Faith. And there he really has a dynamic understanding based on his teacher's teacher, the Baal Shem Tov, a way of understanding how God permeates everything that exists. That really, if we would see the truth, we would see divinity in everything. There's no separation between God and existence other than the tzimtzum. It appears that everything is separate, but it's not the truth. And he explains how that is and why that is. And the third section is Igeret HaTshuva, a letters of repentance. And he talks about not just fixing mistakes that you've made, but the spiritual root of sin and redemption and reclaiming the soul that we lose when we stray. The fourth section is Igeres HaKodesh, and that's letters that he sent. He was a Rebbe, so he was responding to his students' questions. So they would talk to him about what was going on, and he would say things like, don't put somebody up to lead the service who's in a rush to get to work, because that's not the type of prayer service we want to be rushed through. Or often about the importance of giving charity, or the importance of contributing to help those who were settling in the land of Israel of that time. That's the fourth section. A lot of very personal leadership style letters to his followers. And the fifth and final section is called Kuntras Achron, which just means the last version of things, which in effect are very complicated Kabbalistic teachings that he clarifies difficult questions, and the deepest and most misunderstood or hardest to understand part of the time. So that's the 5 sections in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So let's start with, I guess, the first section, I think, is what this would be touching on, about that sort of inner conflict between the God soul and the animal soul. So, what is like the essential sort of understanding that the Alter Rebbe sort of preaches about this conflict of in the individual having to do with the self?
This is predating Freud by 100 years, maybe even more. He divides the self into actually 3 elements, and one he calls the divine soul, and one he calls the animal soul. Before we get into more details, that would explain why, on the one hand, we feel spiritual, we feel altruistic, we feel like we want to do the right thing, we want to do something that's not just about satisfying our own needs and our own desires. We want to do for others. We want to keep rules that are not just about self-interest and self-preservation. On the other hand, we know that even people with good intentions often find themselves failing with all their talk, and not just talk. Sometimes they really talk to themselves more than others. They're not frauds, at least in the conventional sense. A fraud is somebody who knows that they're up to no good and lies to people and doesn't tell the truth. But some people want to do the right thing, and they just seem to mess themselves up. Like they have something in them that things don't go the way they wanted it to, and they get out of control in some areas. So, and a lot of people didn't understand, how could this be happening? I say all these things and I mean them. I thought I mean them, and then I can't deliver. I can't focus. I can't care for other people, because I end up just blowing them off and just doing stupid things and indulging in whatever vices it is that we indulge in. And it turns out that they're both true. They're both parts of a person, and they're at battle within us. Each one is struggling for supremacy. The godly soul, or self, the godly soul manifests as part of the self, and it's trying to get its ideas and its feelings and its actions implemented into our life, but there's an opponent waging a war that doesn't want to do it. It's lazy, it's selfish, it's greedy, it's got appetites and vices. I mean, we need to have appetites, otherwise we would die because we wouldn't have nutrition. But the same appetite could lead us to eating really terrible things and hurting our health. And the same thing, we need to have healthy relationships. That way we can find somebody, get married, have a family. But some of those drives can lead people to do things that really put themselves in danger and put other people in danger and are harmful and cause them to lie and to cheat and to do all terrible things. So the answer is that, yeah, they're both true. They're both parts of who we are. Knowing that doesn't necessarily make it better, but it's like, okay, at least I know what it is. I know what I'm up against.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's go. I mean, there's a lot to say here, but that's the basic premise. Those are the two souls. And then there's kind of like this sense of self that is like the referee between these two aspects of the self. And he calls that the nefesh hachayun. It's just like kind of the life force. And it's kind of neutral, and it could go, and that's based on whether the divine identity soul or animal identity soul gets the better of this intermediary. That will kind of dictate the direction that the person as a whole goes.
Wow, fascinating. It's very fascinating stuff. Okay, great. So then I guess kind of thank you for defining the conflict going from there. Oh, okay. Here's a good way to lead off from the lesson going from there is, so what is, the soul, would the Alter Rebbe, how does he explain in the Tanya the soul, these souls, there's that conflict which you just explained between the animal and the God soul and the intermediary between them. How would he explain how does the Alter Rebbe explain in the Tanya the descent of those souls, how they, how they are within us in our physical bodies?
Like, what is a soul and how does it come into the body? How does it interface with the body? So let's start with which soul interests you more to start with. Should we start with the animal soul or the divine soul?
Well, I guess the divine soul, because I'd love to know how
Okay.
that, having something in your physical body, but how that works, but it's something that is divine and is not human, that is a godly, spiritual.
Okay, so the divine soul the divine soul has more of an affiliation with the mind, and the animal soul has more of an affiliation with the heart. But they both they're invisible. You can only tell what they are by the influence they exert on the body. It's not like you say a doctor is going to dissect the body and find where the animal soul is versus the divine soul. Arguably, there is such a thing that they're finding scientifically that could match up with this, but I'm afraid to use science for interpreting religion. But I'll just give you an example. They say that there's a God gene, and they say there's a gene, a psychopath gene.
Oh, a psychopath gene, and what was the gene you said?
A God gene, yeah, meaning there's like genetic predisposition for people to have faith in God, and not everyone has the gene. And there's other genes that are predisposition for people to be psychopaths. So I don't want to go there, but there is what to be said. If somebody wants to understand genetics and spirituality, or genetics and evil, I don't want to put it on genetics. All I'm trying to say is there might be some part of our biology that can be explained through this kind of this story of the two souls. But I'm going to leave that aside and just say the following. The divine soul has an element of divinity in it, which means it's able to manifest within the person a certain view, a way of being that's in the image of the divine. So in the story of creation in Genesis, when it says, let us make God, a man in our image, in the image of the divine, that actually is what the divine soul is. There's something called the image of the divine, some system. Now, image, we don't usually like to use the word image with God because we don't believe God has an image, but yet we use the word image. And the Kabbalists say that image is referring to the 10 abilities of the soul. That there are 10 divine abilities, there are 10 divine attributes or interfaces that God has, that he manifests himself with. And he gives those things in a much more limited capacity, because it's within, we don't worship a person as a God. The soul comes from God, but isn't God. There's a fine distinction there. And those are those 10 abilities. So the 10 abilities are,
it's like an aspect of those 10 abilities, not
10 powers. Yeah, well, 10 ability, 10 potentials. And the 10 are, and this is the way the Alter Rebbe counts them. There's another way to do it. There's which is the 3 of the 10 are intellectual, cognitive, like wisdom, chachma, understanding, bina, and knowing, like a sense of the idea becoming connected to the identity of the self. That's called dat. Like Adam knew Eve. It's more than just knowing intellectually. It's a intimacy with the idea. And then there are 6 emotional, which are chesed and gvura, love or attraction, and strength or justice. Tiferet, which is beauty or harmony, or compassion, which mediates between extremes of attraction and repulsion, chesed and gvura. Netzach and hod. Netzach is either to dominate, to that like competitive nature that some people have, and hod is empathy, to have the ability to empathize and feel somebody else's pain or somebody else's joy. And yesod, which is bonding, sometimes has a sexual element to it, but it doesn't have to be in a physical, biological sense of sexual, more bonding, like a closeness, that one person wanting to be bonded with another person. It could be totally a spiritual thing, a non-sexual thing. So I use the word carefully without meaning it in an actual physical way, because these are all mystical, really. And the final of the 10 is malchut, which is literally translated as kingship. It often means leadership, but it usually means the step where a potential is about to enter into the actual, like actualizing an idea or a feeling, going into getting ready to manifest in the real world. So those are the 10 powers of the soul. Now, the difference is, when it's a soul, the divine soul, the wisdom of the divine soul is, what is it that is God's will? What is the will? How do I embody God's will? How am I more godlike? So, for example, we know God is a good visitor of the sick, taking care of orphans and widows, and being kind. So that's step A. Are you doing things that God does, which is visiting the sick, taking care of the orphans and the needy? So that's already coming. So when a person's inspired by ideas that help them do good things, anything that's good, that's part of that, with some exceptions, because sometimes we use good as a mask to be even worse. That's an exception. So that's a little bit about the 10 powers of the soul, of the divine soul. Well, I know there's a lot more to be said about them, but that's a simple version of them.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, because it really sums up a good crux of this thing, which is a very deep yet very interesting aspect of this soul section. I'd love to just get a bit into sort of that certain values that the Alter Rebbe really espoused and were very important, that he really emphasized, particularly the one of loving your neighbor as yourself. Could you go into a little bit about why this concept is so important, was so important, and taught about so much by the Alter Rebbe in particular? Or what about it is makes it the most important mitzvah in the Torah?
That's a very good question. Why is loving your neighbor as yourself the most important mitzvah in the Torah? That's what Rabbi Akiva and Hillel taught, which is the most important thing is loving your neighbor as yourself. And why is it? What about all the other mitzvot that are not about human interactions? They're about worshiping God, doing mitzvot for the sake of God. How is that covered by human interaction? And the Alter Rebbe says the answer is the goal and the ability to get there is the same. The only way to really love somebody like yourself is one of two things. Either they're your spouse or your child, so you're invested. That's obvious. You love them, you're invested in them, you care about them. But to love people that you don't have that very specific reason to love, the only way you would be able to do that is if you stop seeing them as competition all the time. And the reason why we see people as competition and we're always jealous of them and angry if they get something, that recognition that we don't get, is because we fail to see that we're really bonded from the soul. We're looking at bodies. We're looking from the body's sense of identity. You are you and I am I, and we're different people. And for sure, if we're at least related, but imagine people are not really related, so they feel like really different. So they're competing with each other. So that accentuates their differences and makes them feel negatively about other people. But if you understood that whole sense of self is an illusion, that really underneath it, we're all ones, we all have the same root of our soul. And the whole sense that we are separate is just so that we can each take care of our respective jobs and our families and have separate bank accounts. But it's not for us to be constantly competing and putting down one another. It's for the sake of being able to overcome that temptation of seeing other people as either somebody to take advantage of or to compete against. Instead, it's to elevate your soul and their soul to the point where you're able to live with a different awareness. The only way to do that is to see the divinity in the world and to see the soulfulness within a person and become more and more aware of your own soul and their soul. And the more you do that, the whole purpose of the Torah is being accomplished. Because the whole purpose of the Torah is to see the divine of the world. The good versus bad is all about seeing what does God want. I'm beginning to see what God wants. I'm able to elevate that. So I know you can ask me more questions if that, I don't know if I fully explained that.
Really fascinating, and it's in my way of understanding what you just said, it completes the phrase. It sort of speaks to the the intermingledness. I don't know, the
Interconnectedness
phrase of love your neighbor as yourself, because it's you have to love your neighbor as yourself, but you also have to love yourself as your neighbor, as opposed to, because it's saying it's changing the mindset to see your fellow human as not competitive, but as one part of the greater goal, which is all of y'all's souls in service to God. And so you have to see yourself and your neighbor and yourself, as opposed
yes,
to
very, very good point. Yes, you have to change your perspective of it just always being about you are you and they are they. And you said also something about including yourself in that love, which is also important. A lot of people don't love themselves, particularly because they look at themselves through the lens of how they think their neighbor is judging them. So it's hard to accept yourself when you look at Instagram and see all these picture perfect. Of course, they're all lies, 99% of what you see on Instagram is a lie. It's not even true, but you don't know that. So you see what's going on Instagram. You think they have this, you don't have that. So you're judging yourself. So the first thing is to love yourself, right? And it's hard to do that because we think loving the self has to do with being seen in a certain light that we think is the right way. That's another addiction that we're addicted to, judging ourselves and judging others. It's all part of the same thing. So yeah, this is trying to break that cycle. Again, is the cycle going to be broken that we'll be perfect, you will be perfect angels? No. The Alter Rebbe knew that we're going to go back and fight even after this revelation of what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. But it's a goal to have. It's something we work on.
Right. That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, I just love that that value and that concept. So lastly, I would just love, I guess, Pesach is coming up, so I'd love to touch on that a bit about, we're going to celebrate our Exodus, our liberation from Egypt and Pesach, and if the Alter Rebbe has any, special teachings or the relevance that even today, because there's so much, like all of what we just talked about is so timeless, of Alter Rebbe's teachings on the topic of Pesach, on any lessons we can learn from the story of Pesach, that we'd like to go into a little bit.
Yes, that's a beautiful thing. I know I always love having the Seder with you. And the idea that the Alter Rebbe, what he does is he says, don't think of Egypt as just a place and a time in history in ancient years ago. He says, no, it's every generation, it's every year, every day. Egypt represents some power in the universe that's holding us back. And by the way, it's not always some power like, oh, it's the Democrats or the Republicans. No, that's not what it is. That's all part of the system that we're in. The system that we're in is meant to enslave us because it's in us. Enslavement is internal. It's our own inability to break free, to recognize our true purpose, to live with the reason why we're here. And that's happening every day. So it's addiction, it's vices, it's hatred, it's jealousy, things that are holding us back. And what we have to believe is that God, just like he took us out of Egypt, gives us power to break out of those very constraints that are our own self-constraints. And we can free ourselves. And we have to believe that. And we have to really try to get out of the things, the patterns, the negative behavior patterns. Today we're so addicted to dopamine, which is released when when somebody likes one of our Facebook posts or other things, and then we get desensitized. So people take drugs to get a high, and then they have to take more and more to get the same high. That is a version of being in Egypt. That we need to learn happiness, internal happiness of a healthy friendship, and it's very hard to do in today's day and age. That's one of the battles we're really, really struggling with. A mighty, mighty struggle. No less a struggle than being a slave in Pharaoh in Egypt. And we're struggling, but we believe in miracles. We believe God can help us, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to face our own demons and be freed from them.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you, Naomi. Looking forward to doing this again soon.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
You're very sweet.
Thank you.
Thank you, and have a good night.